Claudette Colvin taking a stand by staying seated. On March 2nd, 1955, Claudette Colvin took a stand for Black people by declining to move from her seat on a public bus and demanding her constitutional rights. She was arrested, yet her stand influenced many others to take a stand against Jim Crow laws, which led to the Montgomery bus boycott. In the 1956 case of Browder v. Gale, the Supreme Court ruled unconstitutional the statutes and ordinances segregating buses. This allowed Black people to sit in any seat they wished. In the 1960s, laws were passed attempting to end segregation and discrimination altogether. Claudette Colvin helped to start it all. Beginning in the 1870s, especially in the South, Jim Crow laws controlled Black people. As a result, Blacks had to use segregated drinking fountains, restaurants, schools, transportation, and more. In 1896, the Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson upheld the segregation of railroad cars, continuing the rule of separate but equal. A law in Birmingham's racial segregation ordinances stated, "It shall be unlawful to conduct a restaurant at which white and colored people are served in the same room, unless colored persons are effectively separated." These laws were enforced until the Civil Rights Act passage and impacted the treatment of Black people.
On the basketball team that I played on, at the end of the season, they normally have a banquet. I was MVP, and they canceled it because I was a Black player and wasn't no Blacks allowed to attend this restaurant.
Segregation caused many individuals, including Claudette Colvin, to stand up against civil rights. Born in September 1939 in Birmingham, Claudette Colvin had her first encounter with segregation when she was 4. A white boy and his friends came into his door. Claudette explained. The little boy to another little child said, "Hold up your hands, let me see, let me see." And I held up my hands to his hand, and my mother gave me a backhand slap on the forehead. This occurred because Jim Crow laws stated blacks and whites could not touch each other. Claudette's life events influenced her stand. In 1952, her sister, Delphine, tragically died. Colvin explained, "Right after Delphine died, I became very sensitive. Just about any cruel word or insult could start me crying, even if it was aimed at someone besides me." Later, a schoolmate of Colvin's, Jeremiah Reeves, was sentenced to death and electrocuted for a questionable cause. Colvin stated, "Jeremiah Reeves' arrest was the turning point in my life. The reason we got into it was because a boy named Jeremiah Reeves was arrested for supposedly raping a white woman, which he did not do." In 1954, the Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education overturned the rule of separate but equal laws in schools by declaring state laws unconstitutional. Many other laws prevented Black people from being fairly treated, proving that the separate but equal laws were really separate but not equal.
Everything was separate but supposedly equal, but it wasn't so.
In Montgomery, Alabama, a law in the city code stated, "It shall be unlawful for any passenger to refuse to take a seat among the race in which he belongs if there is such a seat vacant." On March 2nd, 1955, Claudette Colvin boarded a bus to ride home from school. A white woman climbed aboard with no empty seats. Claudette later said, "The motorman looked up and said, 'I need those seats.' The other 3 girls in my row got up and moved back, but I didn't. I just couldn't." 1 block north, a squad car was waiting. 2 Montgomery City policemen boarded. When asked who was causing the issue, the motorman pointed at Claudette. I heard him say, "That's nothing new. I've had trouble with that thing before." He called me a thing. The officers demanded she get up. Claudette refused. She began crying and said in a high-pitched voice, "It's my constitutional right to sit here as much as that lady. I paid my fare. It's my constitutional right." They started dragging me backwards off the bus. One of them kicked me. I shouldn't fight back. She was shoved into the squad car. All ride long, they swore at me and ridiculed me. They took turns trying to guess my bra size. They called me a neat and cracked jokes about parts of my body. They took her to an adult jail, although she was 15. Her pastor later bailed her out. Years later, when asked why she stood up, Colvin said it was because of all the unfair treatment that I experienced in my early childhood. It felt like Sojourner Truth's hands were pushing me down on one shoulder, and Harriet Tubman's hands were pushing me down on another shoulder, and I could not move. Once again, at school, students and teachers isolated Colvin. A few of the teachers embraced me, but other teachers seemed uncomfortable. The Colvins contacted Edie Nixon, who helped Colvin find an attorney named Fred Gray. Colvin's charges were violating the segregation law, disturbing the peace, and assaulting the policeman. In her March 1955 hearing, the judge ruled that Colvin was guilty of all charges and placed her on probation. Joan Robinson, a civil rights activist, later wrote, "Claudette's agonized sobs penetrated the atmosphere of the courthouse. Many people brushed away their own tears. The first two charges were later dropped, but Colvin was still convicted of assault. The National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, who fought for equality among races, asked Colvin to join the youth committee. She met Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks as the NAACP fought to use her case to challenge the segregation law. However, once they realized that she had become pregnant by a married man and had been expelled from her school, they ended Colvin's case. Many people rejected Colvin, thinking she was emotional and reckless, which resulted in her living most of her days isolated from others.
9 months after Claudette's stand, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man. Rosa's stand became the face of the new boycott, organized by the NAACP, called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. During this boycott, blacks refused to ride city buses. Instead, they created a system of carpooling. Some walked down the streets to prove they're willing to fight for their rights. The bus systems began to lose profits. Although the boycott wasn't illegal, proven by the First Amendment, many blacks were arrested for protesting the buses. White police officers began to harass protesters, and many, including the civil rights activists, had their property and possessions ravaged. Attorney Fred Gray was involved in the boycott, believing black people should be treated equally. Gray approached Aurelia Browder, Susie McDonald, Mary Louise Smith, and Claudette Colvin, all women mistreated on the Montgomery buses. They agreed to become plaintiffs in the civil action lawsuit, Browder v. Gale. Gray left Parks out of the case because her case was still being decided. The case was a success. The white judges ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. However, the sheriff refused to oblige until the Supreme Court declared, on June 5, 1956, the Montgomery bus system unconstitutional, violating the 14th Amendment. The bus protest later ended, and blacks rode the buses wherever they wanted. Claudette's job opportunities were limited after the incident on the bus. In her civil case, every time she found a job, people recognized her, and she would get fired. However, Claudette's stand inspired the country, created a revolution in black civil rights. It led to many other protests. In 1957, the Little Rock Nine high schoolers were ambushed by crowds of whites when trying to enter a previously white-only school. The children required federal officers to escort them inside the school, allowing them to participate in the all-white learning experience.
In the 1963 March on Washington, peaceful demonstrators, including more than 250,000 blacks, marched down the streets to the Capitol, protesting their rights for jobs and more opportunities. During this protest, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the Lincoln Memorial. Colvin's stand helped lead to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which attempted to end discrimination against others based on their race, religion, etc. But this had limited success. It was still very difficult for Southern blacks to vote. In 1963, the March on Selma, focusing on black voting rights, led to violence and eventually challenged the right to protest, making the country even more aware of the civil rights abuses.
Best friend's dad, he went down to register to vote, and that night they burnt a cross in front of his house.
As a result, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965.
Claudette Colvin inspired people to stand up for themselves. One man wrote to Claudette saying, "The wonderful thing which you have just done makes me feel like a craven coward. How encouraging it would be if more adults had your courage, self-respect, and integrity." Some people despise Claudette Colvin because she was the first person to really challenge the busing laws. Yet Claudette Colvin inspires people to take a stand against the unfair treatment, even to this day. I knew then, and I know now, that when it comes to justice, there is no easy way to get it. You can't sugarcoat it. You have to take a stand and say, "This is not right," and I did.